The navigation officer called the red line at 1400 hours fleet time. She said it the way trained people deliver something true and terrible, with no inflection. Jump coordinates are past the red line, Admiral. Navigational margin of error is 37%. Admiral William Adama stood at the plotting table in the CIC of the Battlestar Galactica and let the number settle. The D-radius was lit wrong. Cylon base stars had materialized at the edge of scanner range 11 minutes ago, 9 of them, closing at the patient velocity of something that had no need to hurry. The civilian ships were spinning up their own drives already, 100 vessels of every improvised class, tankers and freighters and passenger liners, and one luxury liner that had never expected to carry anyone, fleeing anything, all of them carrying the sum of what had survived the fall of the 12 colonies. Behind Adama, a plaque mounted on the CIC's far bulkhead displayed a number. That number was every human being remaining in his universe. Ahead of him, a jump calculation, no colonial fleet officer in their right mind. 18 minutes, Colonel Saul Tighe said from the tactical station. He did not say anything else. He had served with Adama long enough to recognize when the math had already been done. All ships. Adama's voice did not rise. Spin up the drives. Jump. On my mark. The navigation officer began to speak. He spoke over her. I know what we could. The Admiral looked at the plaque one more time. Then at the D-radius, at the 9 closing contacts spread across the display behind them mark. The CIC went white. The Galactica vanished from the Seranus star system in a flash of displaced light. Every ship in the fleet followed, one after another in the staggered cascade of an emergency group jump, 100 silver flashes that emptied the space where humanity had made its last stand. One by one, then the last few, all at once, and then the space they had occupied was empty and silent. The Cylon basters reached those coordinates at minute 18 and found nothing. No fleet, no debris, no signal. Just the fading residue of a jump signature. Unlike any in their navigational records, the colonial fleet arrived in the Alpha Quadrant. Real quick, because I have to know, before we get into this, which character do you want to see cut loose in a universe that's about to have a very bad day? Drop the name in the comments. I read every single one. The arrival was wrong. In ways colonial instruments could not immediately catalogue, the jump had worked, which was its own surprise. The second surprise was the spatial data coming back from D-radius, stars in configurations no colonial navigator had ever charted, no familiar constellation, no reference point matching any map in the ship's computer. The jump had not merely gone long, it had gone somewhere else entirely. The physics of their arrival propagated outward through whatever subspace medium governed this region as a shockwave 3 sectors wide, detectable by instruments the colonial fleet did not carry and could not have imagined. It crossed the space between stars at the speed of information and reached the nearest Federation sensor array 17 seconds after the fleet did. On the bridge of the USS Enterprise D, every panel triggered at once. Captain Jean-Luc Picard was through the bridge doors 40 seconds later. He was a compact, bald man in his mid-60s, with the posture of someone accustomed to rooms that reorganized themselves around his arrival, and he had registered a full tactical picture before he reached his chair. Report. Lieutenant Commander Worf turned from the tactical station. Captain, I'm reading a spatial displacement event bearing 35 Mark 24. 53 vessels have appeared simultaneously. No warp signatures, no approach vector, no transition interval that our sensors could detect. A pause that carried weight. The largest vessel is approximately 1,400 meters in length, Captain. Not one of the 53 contacts is carrying deflector shields. Picard stepped to the view screen, the image resolved as the Enterprise's sensors assembled it from overlapping scan angles. At the center of the display hung a warship of tremendous mass, its hull darkened and scored in the pattern of a vessel that had absorbed weapons impacts repeatedly and endured each one, its lines unlike anything in the Federation contact database, its gun emplacements visible as heavy raised structures along its flanks, projectile cannon mountings built for kinetic delivery rather than energy beams. Behind it, in ragged and uneven formation, dozens of civilian vessels of every improvised class held their position, the clustering of people who had learned to stay near the only armed thing left. Lieutenant Commander Data spoke from the operations station. The android was the ship's second officer, and his voice carried the measured evenness of a mind processing what it observed without first deciding how to feel about it. Captain, the propulsion system that produced this spatial signature does not operate through subspace in any mode recorded in our database. These vessels arrived instantaneously, without warp field generation, without dilithium emissions, without plasma wake of any kind. Transit from origin to current position appears to have taken no measurable time. He reviewed his instruments for 2 additional seconds. Point-to-point spatial translocation at this scale. 53 vessels simultaneously. Captain, there is no precedent for this capability in Federation science. The largest vessel, Picard said, armament, kinetic energy projectile weapons in primary and secondary batteries, nuclear warhead delivery systems, exact count uncertain, no energy weapon emplacements of any kind, no deflector shields. Data looked up from his console. If this vessel's crew intends hostility, it carries no protection against our phaser arrays, but its nuclear ordnance at close range would be sufficient to threaten this ship. 200,000 kilometers from the Enterprise, Galactica's DRADs had been tracking that same contact since the moment of arrival. One vessel, energy-dense, unknown classification. Not a Cylon base star. Not anything in any colonial recognition file. It was sitting at range, without firing, without launching, without the aggressive forward drift colonial officers had learned to read as preparation to engage. "No," Adama said. He studied the display and said nothing else for a moment. The stars through the CIC viewports were wrong. The navigational reference system had been running continuous matches since their arrival and had found nothing. 0 results against any colonial chart. No familiar designation in any database the fleet carried. They had crossed the red line and gone far beyond it, past any coordinate their civilization had ever named. The last 9 jumps had been running from Cylons. This one had apparently run from the universe itself. "Where in the frack are we?" Tai said. Adama did not answer that. He had no answer that was useful. He looked at the plaque on the CIC bulkhead. The number on it had not changed. It was the number it had been before the jump, before the last 9 jumps, before every loss and every death and every choice that had carried them here. That number was all that was left of human civilization from their universe. Every name it represented, every child and cook and pilot and medic aboard the fleet's 100 vessels, everyone who had made it through the fall of the 12 colonies and the month since, every life, the plaque still counted. Everything. "Action stations," Adama said. "Load the tubes. All Viper pilots to Ready 5. Alert the CAG." He looked at the unknown contact on DRADIS one more time. A capital ship sitting still, not firing. Possibly something that had never encountered a colonial vessel. Possibly something that had seen everything and was deciding what they were worth. "Do not fire unless I give the word." The CIC held its quiet around him, every officer at their station, waiting on the one certainty in the room. He looked at the wrong stars through the viewport. "Find me something I can navigate by." The Enterprise D moved at 1/4 impulse, slow enough that the approach read as deliberate, not a charge. An announcement. Commander William Riker stood at the con and watched the sensor returns build. The colonial vessels were holding formation, which was discipline. And discipline at that scale meant command. The warship, at the center of the display, had not adjusted orientation. "No warp signature at all," he said. "No subspace distortion, no plasma wake, nothing in our classification catalog. Whatever that drive system is, it is not warp." He pulled the data stream again. It's as if 53 ships fell through a hole in the universe. "That," Picard said from the command rail, "may be precisely what happened." He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man thinking faster than he was letting show. Universal translator. "Still locking," the ensign at communications reported. "The subspace distortion from their arrival is still degrading across 3 sectors. It's interfering with the translation matrix baseline. I need another 4 minutes for a reliable lock." "Then we have 4 minutes." Picard did not move from the rail. "Worf, nearest Starfleet support, USS Endeavour and USS Crazy Horse Captain, 41 minutes at maximum warp." 41 minutes the Enterprise moved forward. On Galactica's DA Redis, the unknown contact had been closing for 7 minutes, and Ty had spent 6 of them arguing with himself. The approach vector was textbook. Prus. The range discipline was exact. The contact's energy signature matched nothing in any colonial recognition database, which was the same category of nothing that had gotten colonial officers killed 11 months ago when the ships reading clean on D. Radis had turned out to be Cylons. The contact's drive system looked like nothing in their records, but Cylon technology had surprised them before, right up until the point where Galactica's hull had started bearing the marks of how many times it survived. Ty looked at the display and thought, Cylon. He thought, bait. Cylon, again. Underneath that. Adama stood at the plotting table and looked at the same display and said nothing. He had learned, across 30 years of command, to give his instincts time to compete with the available data before he let either of them win. His son did not wait. At the CAG station on the CIC's edge, Lee Adama keyed the flight deck. Alert 5, all pilots to ready. 5. I want a cap element deployed between us and that contact in 90 seconds. He looked at the display. Mark 7 pilots launch first. Meki I is in reserve. The flight pod doors open. 6 Vipers cleared their tubes in pairs, the launch sequence driving a physical percussion through Galactica's hull, and swung out into a patrol arc between the fleet and the closing vessel. Whatever was on that contact, it would now have to pass through a wall of colonial steel to reach anyone behind them. The contact did not slow. Still closing, Ty said. Adama watched the DRADIS. The communication arrived 90 seconds later, hitting all colonial frequencies at once in a language the fleet's translation software took a full minute to partially resolve. The result was slightly late, slightly off in the idiom, the way a translation sounds when the words are right, but the structure has been assembled by something that has never heard them spoken in that order before. A man's voice, measured, precise, carrying authority the way old material carries weight. This is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise, representing the United Federation of Planets. You have entered Federation space. We mean you no harm. Please respond. The CIC went quiet. A communications technician at his station, not specifically addressing anyone, said, That's not Cylon. Adama looked at him. How do you know? The technician opened his mouth and closed it again. He had a feeling. Feelings had gotten people killed. Lee Adama moved from the CAG station to the center of the CIC because a Cylon fleet wouldn't ask first. He said it evenly without urgency, the way he had learned to speak in this room when he needed to be heard rather than dismissed. They have never asked first, and this ship has been decelerating for the last 3 minutes. Oh, could be bait, Ty said. Everything could be bait. Lee looked at his father. We jumped 11 months ago and we have been running since. We just went past the edge of our own universe, past any coordinate on any chart this fleet carries. That contact out there is sending a voice instead of weapons. That is different from anything that has happened to us since the fall. He let it sit for a moment. I think we should answer it. Ty looked at Adama. He had the expression he wore when he had already reached a conclusion he didn't trust himself to reach alone, and so he was waiting for Adama to reach it alongside him, which was the particular arithmetic of a 30-year friendship. Adama said nothing for a moment. He looked at the Diradis, at the unknown vessel maintaining its approach, at the 6 Vipers holding their arc. He looked at the survivor count on the plaque. He had made decisions on worse intelligence than this, and some of them had been right, and some of them had cost him people he could not get back. He had not decided yet. In the Viper, holding the point position of the cap arc, the pilot had been flying with her targeting system live for 3 minutes. She was not making a conscious choice. 11 months of pursuit had rewired the interval between threat assessment and response to something shorter than thought. And so when the contact passed 130,000 kilometers, without slowing and without veering, her thumb moved on the stick with nothing she would have called intent, and the targeting lock engaged. On the Enterprise bridge, every tactical board registered it simultaneously. Weapons lock, Captain, Worf said. Flat, controlled. His hand was already at the shield panel, where the control was available in under a second. Picard did not look away from the view screen. Hold course. Do not raise shields. Riker spoke the captain's rank. 1 syllable, carrying everything a first officer compresses into that word when he believes his commanding officer is about to get them both killed. Picard said, I said, hold. The Enterprise continued at 1/4 impulse, shields down, weapons uncharged, moving directly into the kill zone of a Viper formation whose targeting systems were all reading active on Worf's board. The Galaxy-class starship had enough firepower to scatter the colonial fleet across 3 sectors. It continued forward anyway, unarmed and open, because its captain had decided this was what was required. On Galactica's CIC, Ty watched the Federation vessels approach, on Dradis. It hasn't raised shields, he said, to no one in particular, in the flat tone of a man saying something he cannot yet classify. A ship that size and it hasn't raised shields. Adama was already at the comm. He keyed the channel himself. He used no diplomat's phrasing, because this was not yet diplomacy. He said what was accurate. This is Admiral William Adama, Battlestar Galactica. We are not a threat, unless you make us one. Stand down your approach, and we will talk. The seconds that followed had the specific density of moments when both parties know the next action will determine everything that comes after it. On the Enterprise bridge, Picard looked at Riker. Something in the captain's expression had shifted in the way of a man who has watched another person do the thing he had been hoping for and is not quite ready to call it relief. He looked back at the view screen, at the warship hanging still across 140,000 kilometers, its hull bearing every mark of what it had survived, 50,000 people behind it, none of them firing. Make it so, Picard said. The Enterprise stopped. The space between the two fleets held. The Viper pilot's targeting lock stayed active. The Enterprise's shields stayed down. Somewhere in the colonial fleet, 100 FTL drives were warm and ready, every ship capable of jumping the instant Adama gave a word he had not yet given. Neither side was firing. Neither side had run. The Enterprise opened a channel to Starfleet Command, flagging the contact and the coordinates, requesting support at elevated priority. 41 minutes first contact. The shakiest kind, and the only kind that changes anything. The proposal came from Picard directly, in a tone that did not invite negotiation. He stood at the Enterprise's con and looked at the sensor overlay of the colonial fleet. 53 vessels in loose formation, the largest of them bearing hull damage, consistent with repeated weapons impacts, and zero detectable deflector field. No energy shields anywhere across the formation. The entire fleet was open. "I intend to beam over," Picard said. Troy spoke from the counselor's position without turning. "I'd recommend against it." She had been sensing the emotional landscape of that fleet since first contact, and what came through was a wound, not a welcome. "I didn't say it would be welcomed." Picard looked at Riker. "They have no shields. If I beam over without asking, I demonstrate that we respect their sovereignty. We don't simply materialize wherever we choose, because we are able to. If I ask and they say yes, they've made a deliberate choice." Riker studied the sensor display. "And if they say no?" Picard considered this for the length of time it took him to decide he was not going to alter his answer. "Then we beam over anyway and apologize afterward." He was joking mostly. "Data," Picard said. "You're with me." In the corridor outside the CIC, a shimmer of light materialized. It was not a sound. It was not visible in any way the colonial marines on corridor watch would have been able to describe afterward, because they had trained for infiltrators and drunkards and Cylon infiltration, all of which arrived through hatches or vents or maintenance access. None of their training contained a category for two human silhouettes, assembling themselves from nothing in the space between a locker and the starboard bulkhead. What resolved in that space? A compact man in a red-shouldered uniform, standing with both hands visible and his posture entirely composed, the bearing of a person for whom walking out of nowhere is a mode of travel like any other. Next to him, a figure with yellow eyes and a face of complete stillness, looking at the corridor with the patient attention of something taking systematic inventory of what everything in it meant. The Marines had their weapons up before the shimmer finished fading. Sidearms, not rifles. This was a CIC post. The senior Marine's voice was stripped to reflex. What the frack was that nobody answered. The man in the red-shouldered uniform waited. He did not reach for anything. He stood still and let them look. Adama came through the hatch from the CIC. He stopped 2 meters from the strangers and looked at them the way he looked at Dradis returns with no match in the recognition database, with complete attention and no expression. Picard was compact and bald, standing with the posture of a man whose spine had decided long ago to be the best answer to any room that contained weapons. Next to him, yellow eyes, a man's face in every proportion and detail, and a stillness that Adama registered before his training could classify it. Not the stillness of threat. The stillness of something that simply was calm, rather than performing calm, which turned out to be its own category of wrong. Someone in the corridor had spoken in the moment while the Admiral was reading them. One word, aimed at nothing in particular. Cylon. The figure with the yellow eyes turned toward the sound. He found the direction, located the person who had spoken, and looked at them with the same expression he had used for the corridor and the Marines, and presumably the transit through whatever physics had delivered them here. "I am Lieutenant Commander Data of the USS Enterprise." The android's voice was even and entirely clear. "I am an android. A positronic artificial intelligence constructed in human form. I am not a Cylon. I am not in fact familiar with that term, though I would be glad to learn." He paused for one precise beat. "I find this meeting most interesting." The corridor held its silence. Nobody fired. Adama looked at Picard. "Captain, Admiral." Picard stepped forward and extended his hand. Adama, after a moment, took it. "I apologize for the unannounced arrival. I did not think an armed escort through your airlock would improve the impression." "It wouldn't have," Adama said. "You can explain your travel method later." On the Enterprise, Troy had not moved from the counselor's position. Her eyes were closed. What came through across 40,000 kilometers of interstellar vacuum was not one thing. 50,000 people in grief, so structural it had become load-bearing, and underneath that grief, rage cooled by combat into something useful, and underneath the rage, a pocket of wrongness she had no name for. Multiple sources. Something that did not feel entirely like a person feels. She opened her eyes. Riker was watching her. "There is something wrong aboard that fleet," she said. "I don't know what yet. I need to be aboard it to find out." Adama walked them through the CIC. Picard took in the layout with the attention of someone trained to read command centers, hand-operated panels, each station physically isolated from every other. No networked displays. No wireless communication between systems. A paper binder in a wall rack, printed on actual paper. Every station, an island, he asked carefully. "Your computer systems. They are not networked." Adama stopped walking. He looked at a section of bulkhead, and then at Picard, and his face did the specific thing a man's face does when he has given an answer enough times that the giving of it has worn the answer smooth. "Because our machines used our networks to kill 50 billion people," Adama said. "We learned not to make that mistake twice." Picard said nothing. Behind him, Data's head turned a fraction of a degree toward the nearest isolated panel. He looked at it for 2 seconds, which was a very long time for him to spend processing something he could read in a millisecond. He was not reading the panel. He was standing very still, because what Adama had just said had done something to whatever passed in him for the processing of statements about artificial beings and what they were capable of doing. President Roslin entered the CIC from the aft passage. She was a woman in her early 50s in a civilian suit that showed its wear. She walked with the care of someone managing something physical with every step, effort made invisible by practice. She looked at Picard with the directness of a person who had learned to use available time carefully. "I'm told you represent a political body," she said. "Not just a ship. The United Federation of Planets," Picard confirmed. 150 member worlds and dozens of affiliated territories. Roslin absorbed this. "Are there others out here?" "Civilizations." A pause that was not casual. "Safe places, many," Picard said. "Are they safe for humans?" Picard chose his words with the deliberateness of a man who had learned across many first contacts that the difference between a reassurance and a promise was the most important distinction in diplomacy. "That is," he said, "a definition we take seriously." Roslin held his gaze for a moment, then looked once at Data without expression and walked back out. Data had drifted toward the flight pod viewing port. 3 Viper. Mark 1, I sat on the deck below. 8 meters of kinetic weapons, platform lines designed for function. Past the point of aggression, hull plating heat-scored from recent combat, gun assemblies mounted at angles that left nothing ambiguous about their purpose. He examined them with complete attention. A crew technician had noticed him. The man was perhaps 25, with the particular stillness of someone who has trained to contain a reaction that keeps trying to surface. He stood 4 meters from the android and watched him with a hostility that had gone quiet from sheer thoroughness. Data became aware of being observed. He did not move away from the port. After a long moment, the technician spoke. "You have a pulse." Data turned, "Yes, a functional equivalent, a circulatory pump that manages the temperature of my processing components." "Cylons have pulses," the technician said. "So do humans," Data said. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was also different in quality from the silence in the corridor when someone had said the word and aimed it at the thing with yellow eyes. That silence had been used against something. This one was something else. Possibly a question that had not yet found its shape. Data waited. After a moment, the technician looked back at the Viper below. Data looked at it as well. They stood at the port together and said nothing, which was not the same as nothing happening. 3 additional Starfleet vessels had taken up position around the colonial fleet by the time the second morning watch rolled over on Galactica, and nobody on either side was pretending it was anything other than what it was. The colonials called it a cage. Not aloud, not in those words, but the word was in how the pilots in the ready room sat when the ships appeared on Dradus at precise triangulated intervals, a posture belonging to people who had spent 11 months running. 2 of them had quietly checked their jump drives without being ordered to. Adama said nothing. He noted it. On the Enterprise, Riker logged it differently. A protective screen, a reasonable precaution. Both descriptions were accurate, which was the kind of diplomatic precision that meant neither one was honest. Adama understood the terms and accepted them because he had no better options, and because the man who commanded the Enterprise had held course with his shields down into an active weapons lock, which was either the most confident thing Adama had ever witnessed, and in 30 years of command he had learned those were frequently the same thing when it worked. The medical teams arrived on the 3rd day. Roslin had agreed to it in a meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes. Her logic was what it always was. If the fleet's civilians were sick, they needed care, and pride was a currency she had stopped spending on anything except where it counted. Federation doctors materialized aboard the civilian vessels in pairs and threes, carrying equipment that fit in a hand, that scanned in seconds, that could tell them things colonial medicine took an hour of imaging to approach. They were efficient and careful, and their tricorders were transmitting encrypted data back to the Enterprise with every pass. The first anomalous reading came from a recovery bay on the Zephyr, a passenger liner repurposed as a hospital ship within 48 hours of the fall. A Viper pilot, admitted 2 days prior for a fractured leg, had been scanned as routine intake. The medical officer reviewed the result twice and sent it up the chain flagged for specialist review. The tricorder had found biological architecture it could not classify, tissue patterns that were human in most respects and structured differently in others, in ways the Federation database had no entry for. The second anomalous reading arrived 6 hours later. A senior colonial officer scanned during a routine pass through the CIC deck. Same category of wrong, nearly human, and then not. Neither reading had a name attached to it yet. The medical officer did not know what she was looking at. Someone else did. The operative had been aboard the Enterprise under a cleared crew manifest for 9 days, which was 4 days before the colonial fleet arrived. Section 31 did not brief its operatives on the target before deployment. It briefed on the method, and the target had declared itself the moment the colonial fleet's jump shockwave hit the sector. The encrypted medical flags took 11 minutes to intercept. Another 6 to cross-reference against the Colonial Fleet's personnel roster and the data Section 31 had been pulling from long-range scans since first contact. The result was a probable match. One anomalous reading belonged to a known Cylon by the Colonial Fleet's own designation. The other belonged to someone the fleet trusted completely. The operative composed a short message on a channel that did not appear in the Enterprise's communications log. The orders that came back were 4 words: extract, study. Say nothing. The captain would not be informed. Troy had beamed to the Pyxis, the fleet's designated medical ship, presenting herself to the colonial staff as a counselor offering support services, which was true. She was also the most sensitive, empathic instrument the Federation had, and no colonial countermeasure could block her. She found what she was looking for, or rather, it found her. There was a mess hall on the Pyxis's lower deck, where off-duty civilians gathered during rest cycles. Troy passed through it on her way to the medical bay, and something stopped her. A sensation, a pocket in the room where the emotional resonance went wrong, the way a chord goes wrong when one instrument plays in a different key from the others and the error is felt before it is understood. A man sat alone at a far table. He was heavyset, graying with the kind of face that had been through enough that it had stopped trying to show what it was thinking. He was staring at his hands. The wrongness was coming from him. He was not grieving in the way the people around him were grieving. He was doing something else with what he felt, something that functioned differently, something the counselor had no clean name for. She did not approach. She stood in the corridor entrance and looked at him for a long moment, then made a careful note of his location and the specific quality of the resonance. The note went into her report. Picard was in his ready room when Worf entered, with the deliberate economy of a man who had organized his observations into the version that would be most useful. "I have been watching their pilots," the security chief said, "through the viewport at the flight pod junction. Their discipline is exceptional." He paused. "Their grief is not concealed. It is worn. They fight like people who have already lost everything and have nothing left to lose. That is either the most dangerous kind of soldier or the most unreliable." Picard looked at him. Perhaps both. Worf considered this with the gravity he reserved for assessments he did not want to agree with. "Yes," he said. "Perhaps both." Near the starboard landing bay junction, Lee found Data standing at a bulkhead display. Lee had come because a question had been sitting in him since the corridor outside the CIC, and the one person in this universe who might answer it without deflecting was the one who had the most reason to. "What are you?" Lee said. Data turned. "I am an artificial being. I was created by a human scientist, served as a Starfleet officer, and my right to self-determination was established by a Federation court of law," he considered. "I am told that is more than many beings achieve." Lee looked at him. "Our machines tried to exterminate us." "I know," Data said. "I am also told that the response among your people is to regard beings like me as threats requiring evidence to the contrary, rather than persons requiring cause for suspicion. I find that understandable." He met the CAG's eyes without hesitation, and also incorrect as applied to me. "How do I know you're different?" Data considered the question with the fullness it deserved. "The same way I know any being is different from another," he said, "by what they do." Lee was quiet for a long moment. He did not answer. He walked back the way he had come, and Data watched him go with the calm of a being who had learned that an unanswered question was not the same as a rejected one. In a science lab on Deck 7 of the Enterprise, Gaius Baltar was performing competence. He had been performing it his entire career, which was one of the reasons the career had been good. He was doing it now for 3 Federation scientists sitting across a table covered in equipment he did not recognize, answering questions about colonial biology, with the careful omission of anything that would lead somewhere he could not follow. Head 6 stood in the corner. He glanced at her. She shook her head slightly the way she did when she believed he was making a mistake and had already decided not to tell him what it was. He looked back at the scientists. "Yes," he said, applying the smile that had opened 3 research fellowships and several situations he preferred not to think about. "I would be delighted to explain the CNP's base architecture. It is, if I say so myself, rather elegant." No sensor in the room registered anything in the corner where she stood. The encrypted medical flags were still moving through channels that did not officially exist, toward people who officially did not exist, toward a plan that had already begun. The extraction happened at 0340 fleet time, during the window between medical resupply transfers, when traffic between the convoy and the Starfleet vessels was routine enough to go unscrutinized. 2 assets materialized aboard the Kimba, a civilian transport sitting third in the convoy's inner formation. They were precise and quiet, and they had the advantage of a technology the fleet had never learned to defend against, and for approximately 3 seconds, they were the most dangerous people in the colonial fleet. Sharon Agathon had been asleep in her bunk. She woke to the half-second of transporter contact that dissolved before it completed. The beam had attempted to lock onto her signal, and could not resolve it, because she was not entirely the thing it had been programmed to acquire. Her biological digital architecture read wrong at the molecular level, and the targeting system had no protocol for what to do with a consciousness that was built differently from the inside. The lock released. She was at the comm before the assets in the corridor outside had time to abort. DRADIS contact. Her voice was flat and specific, stripped of everything except the information that needed to move. Unauthorized beam-in aboard the Kimba. 2 contacts. Corridor C. Deck 4. This is not a drill. The CIC on Galactica received the signal 11 seconds later. Adama was at the plotting table before the alert finished sounding. He did not ask Picard for permission. He did not open a channel to the Enterprise. He looked at Tai, who was already moving to the tactical station, and keyed the fleet-wide channel himself. All ships, action stations. Galactica, actual to all fleet elements. If any Federation, vessel, or personnel attempts to board us without prior authorization, you're authorized to respond with lethal force. That is not a suggestion. He looked at the launch readiness board. "Shay, I need 12 fighters off the deck in 90 seconds. 12 Vipers launched in 84. The Section 31 craft had been holding position 200,000 kilometers off the convoy's starboard side under a Starfleet registry that identified it as a supply tender. It had been there for 3 days. When Galactica's fighters launched, and the fleet began spinning up active targeting, the craft broke position and went to warp without a word on any channel. 3 Vipers and 2 FTL-capable Raptors. The jump placed them directly in the craft's projected warp exit corridor, 11 seconds ahead of its current heading. The Section 31 vessel dropped out of warp to find 5 colonial fighters arrayed across its path in a weapons-live formation. The craft's shields came up instantly, a reflex action from a pilot who had run this kind of operation before, and understood that shields meant safe, that the gap between shield capacity and incoming weapons fire was a calculation it could win. That assumption had been built on a different kind of weapons fire. The first volley of kinetic rounds hit the shield bubble at a combined velocity that the craft's threat matrix had never been asked to account for. The shields held. The second volley arrived before the engineer had finished assessing the first impact, and the results were different. A deflector shield was built to disperse energy across frequencies, to spread phaser fire and disruptor pulses across its surface and bleed them off into heat. A physical projectile did not have a frequency to disperse. The shield had to absorb the impact directly, and it had not been built to do that indefinitely, and it was not doing it indefinitely now. The craft dropped to impulse. The Raptors moved to bracket position. Nobody fired again. Nobody needed to. On the Enterprise, the incident report arrived while Picard was reviewing the morning medical summaries. He read it once. He set it down. He was quiet for a moment that everyone on the bridge registered in the particular way that people register silence from someone who is more frightening when calm than when loud. "Find me the operative," Picard said. He did not elaborate. Riker did not ask. This was Section 31. This was what the Federation kept in its basement, and called a necessary tool and could never entirely account for when the accounting became public. And it had just nearly started a war in the middle of a first contact with a fleet of 50,000 traumatized survivors who were already looking for a reason to confirm that they had made a mistake by not running. Worf had pulled the sensor data from the confrontation and reviewed it twice before bringing it to the captain. The security chief stood at attention with the economy of a man who had organized his report into the version most likely to be acted upon. The colonial fighter craft are extraordinarily maneuverable. Two more so than our tactical projections suggested, even after reviewing their initial launch data. He paused, which was notable. And their weapons. Our shields performed less effectively against them than I would have predicted. Data was at the operations console, working through the same sensor record. A precise observation. The colonial weapons deliver kinetic energy, physical projectiles at high velocity, against deflector shields that were calibrated for energy frequency threats, phasers, disruptors, Polaron beams. The harmonics are tuned to disperse energy across the frequency spectrum. He looked up from his display. A physical projectile does not have a frequency to disperse. The shield must absorb the impact mechanically, which it is considerably less equipped to do. He paused in the way he paused when a conclusion was not comfortable. The colonials carry no shields. Their adversaries may never have anticipated their weapons. Picard absorbed this. He looked at the sensor overlay of the colonial fleet sitting in formation around Galactica. He had been thinking of them as vulnerable. 53 ships, none shielded, all of them carrying weapons that his own defensive systems were not optimized to stop. The assessment required revision. Adama opened a channel to the Enterprise 40 minutes later. "Who sent that team?" he said. No preamble. Picard did not look away from the screen. "Someone who does not speak for Starfleet or the Federation. I give you my word." Adama was quiet for a moment. "Your word." He let the weight of it sit. "Captain, where I come from, the things that tried to kill us told us they meant no harm right up until the moment they started. I have had considerable practice at believing people who turned out to be wrong." A pause that had a shape to it. "I'm going to need more than your word." "You'll have it," Picard said. On the Galactica's communications deck, Roslin had been watching a subspace transmission feed when the incident report reached her. She had immediately opened a channel to Deep Space Nine. Sisko listened to her account without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Welcome to the Federation," he said a beat. "It's harder than it looks." Something shifted in Roslind's expression, toward something that was not quite a smile and was closer to recognition. Two people who had been handed the weight of their respective worlds by circumstances that had not consulted them about the timing. "It usually is," she said. Athena was in the corridor of the Kimbahuta when Hilo found her, standing with her back against the bulkhead, not pacing, not moving, not shaking, because she was Cylon, and Cylons did not shake the way humans shook when fear had moved through them. Her responses were built differently. She had long since stopped explaining that to people who found it unsettling. Her eyes were doing something complicated. Halo stood next to her without speaking first. He looked at the same section of bulkhead she was looking at. "They know what I am," Athena said. "They were going to take me apart." "They didn't," Halo said. She looked at him. The complicated thing in her expression did not resolve into anything simpler. "This time," she said. The word sat in the corridor of a ship that had been carrying civilian passengers 11 months ago, on routes that had felt permanent. Hello took her hand. She let him. Outside, the fleet held its formation, Vipers on alert, drives warm, every ship in the convoy running with its D-radius at maximum gain, watching the space around them with the vigilance of people who had learned that the threat did not always look like a threat. The signal reached Deep Space Nine's long-range sensors at 1847 hours station time, and Sisko recognized what he was looking at before the analysis finished running. A Borg probe. Moving fast, heading from the galactic rim on a bearing that, when extrapolated, resolved toward the colonial fleet's position in the Alpha Quadrant. He opened a channel to the Enterprise without waiting for the analysis to complete. Picard listened to the sensor data without interrupting. When Sisko finished, the captain was quiet for a moment. The Borg detected the jump signature. "That's not something they've done before," Sisko said. "Long-range probes, yes, but targeting a specific jump event at this range. Because nothing has ever jumped like that before." Picard looked at the tactical display. The Colonial Fleet's FTL system did not operate through subspace. It produced no warp distortion, no plasma wake, no dilithium emissions. What it produced was an instantaneous displacement, a point-to-point translocation that left a resonance in space-time that no warp drive had ever generated, that the Borg had never catalogued, that was in every meaningful sense new. The Borg wanted everything new. "Alert the fleet. I need to speak with Admiral Adama." The conversation happened in Galactica's CIC, Picard at one end of the plotting table and Adama at the other, the space between them holding the particular quality of a meeting where both parties know something has shifted and neither has yet said it aloud. Picard set out the facts in the order a military officer would want them. One Borg cube had engaged Starfleet at a location designated Wolf 359. The engagement had lasted 11 minutes. 11,000 Starfleet personnel had died. The cube had continued on its heading afterward and had been stopped by a single act that the Admiral did not need to know the details of. The relevant detail was this. One cube had done all of that, and what was moving toward them from the galactic rim was a probe sent ahead of whatever the collective had decided to dispatch. Adama listened through all of it without expression. When Picard finished, the Admiral looked at the plotting table for a moment. "How did you stop them?" he said. "We didn't. Not by force." Picard met his eyes. "We found a way to use the hive mind against itself. A single point of access to the coordinating signal. We disrupted it at the moment that mattered." He paused. The opportunity cost of that approach was considerable. Adama looked at him in the way a person looks at someone when they recognize the shape of a sentence without being told what it means. The way a person speaks when they are describing a loss they are still carrying in the present tense. He did not ask what the cost had been. He did not need to. "We know something about hive minds," Adama said, "and about the cost." Picard nodded slowly. "Then, your Cylons, they are artificial. They network. They operate through something that functions like a collective consciousness. Yes. And what they want from you," Picard said, "is not merely your extinction." Adama was quiet for a moment. "They want us back. Defeated people to rule over. A lesson carved into 50 billion deaths about what happens when the creation decides it's finished serving." He looked at the Dradis display. "Extinct doesn't teach anyone anything." "De Borg wants something similar," Picard said. "Assimilation over extermination, your biological and technological distinctiveness added to their own. The difference is that the Borg do not leave the people they assimilate intact enough to know what they've lost." He held Adama's gaze. "They do not leave survivors." In the science lab on Deck 7 of the Enterprise, the conversation had moved from interrogation to collaboration sometime around Baltar's third analysis, and Baltar was the last person in the room to recognize the shift. The Federation scientists had run 3 separate genomic sequences on the tissue samples Roslyn's medical staff had provided, and the results were consistent across all 3. Colonial DNA was human DNA, or rather, it was the nearest genetic equivalent the universe had produced, a lineage that had diverged from a common ancestor tens of thousands of years ago, a branch of the human family tree that had been somewhere else for longer than any colonial historical record could trace. The scientists were asking him questions not to establish what he knew, but because they wanted to know what he thought, which was a distinction Baltar had been chasing his entire career. Het 6 was standing at his shoulder. She stood close and said, in the way she said, things that only he could hear, that this was exactly the kind of exposure that ended with him being studied rather than admired, and that he had never once survived being studied. He did not look at her. He was feeling admired. It was, reliably, his most effective blind spot. The D-Radis alarm sounded on Galactica at 22:03 hours, and there was one specific second where the entire CIC watch stood completely still before training took over. A jump signature detonated in the outer system. Then 7 more in rapid sequence, each one painting the D-Radis display in the pattern that every colonial officer had spent 11 months learning to hate. 9 signatures total. Cylon base stars, emerging from FTL at coordinated intervals, the precise insertion of a fleet that had calculated their position from residual data rather than followed their trail. The colonial jump drives left a signature that Cylon navigation computers had been built to pass, and the Cylons had been patient, and they had been precise. On the lead base star, a number 1 ran his eyes across the sensor feeds with the calm of a being who had authored this outcome from the beginning, a Federation vessel of significant displacement. Multiple unknown contacts in escort formation. And the colonial fleet, sitting in the center of all of it, exactly where 50,000 traumatized humans always ended up. Surrounded. He was not alarmed. He had not been alarmed since before he engineered the fall of the 12 colonies. He was interested. A signal transmitted on colonial frequencies, imperfectly resolved by the Enterprise's universal translator. The idiom assembled from components rather than spoken. "Hello, Admiral. I see you've found new friends. I do hope they're ready for what you brought with you." In the CIC, Adama's jaw set. Ty's hand moved to the tactical console and stopped there. He did not speak. What he wanted to say had Cavill's name in it, and a word before it that stood for 11 months of running. And everyone those months had cost, and he kept it behind his teeth because the Admiral had not given the order yet. "I heard him," Adama said. "Target the lead Bay Star." A pause. "Don't fire yet." On the Enterprise bridge, Picard stood at the center of the situation, with the stillness of a man who had been in impossible rooms before and had developed a method for them. "The Prime Directive," he said, in the tone of a man talking through the last objection before he removes it, "requires that we not interfere with the natural development of another civilization. We are already in contact with both parties. We have already interfered. The only question now is how we proceed, not whether we do." He turned to the tactical station. "Battle stations," he said. In a Viper on Galactica's port launch tube, Kara Thrace was running pre-launch checks with the efficiency of someone who had done it enough times that the sequence had become muscle. A Federation engineer, who had been cleared for flight pod access as part of the technical exchange program, had drifted close to her tube, studying the propulsion configuration with the expression of someone trying to understand an object that had been built by people who had different assumptions about everything. He asked about the drive. First, she explained it in 22 words. He asked how she navigated at those velocities in a universe where the jump committed her to a heading the moment the drive spooled, where there was no real-time correction once the decision was made. Starbuck looked up from her panel. "You point it where you're going and you trust." He waited. He had the expression of someone who thought there was more to the answer. "And if you're wrong," she said, "you don't find out for long." He looked at her, then at the Viper, then at the DRADIS display mounted above the launch tube, where 9 Baystar contacts were sitting in the outer system saying nothing. He decided not to ask a third question. Starbuck went back to her panel. The launch authorization light above her tube was already amber. The raiders launched first. They came out of the base stars in waves, not in formation, because formation implied a kind of tactical thinking that Cylon raiders did not need and had never needed. What they were was less a fighter craft and more a weapon that had opinions about its heading. Semi-organic, semi-mechanical, faster in vacuum than most Starfleet pilot assessments had accounted for, and faster at close range than any of that mattered, because close range was where they were going. They poured into the space between the two fleets in numbers that made the tactical display look like a weather event, and the Starfleet runabouts and shuttles that went out to meet them discovered within 90 seconds that they had been designed for a different kind of war. A runabout was a general-purpose vehicle. It performed many functions adequately, including combat, in the sense that it carried phaser emitters and could fire them accurately. It had not been designed to exist in a rolling 3-dimensional knife fight at close range against an enemy that treated proximity to the target as a tactical asset and had no regard for its own structural integrity when closing. The Vipers launched. Starbuck was first off the deck, which was not a coincidence and was not ambition. Her relationship with the launch sequence had compressed to the point where the tube doors were still cycling when she was already calculating where the fight was going to be. She cleared the flight pod and rolled into the engagement zone, and the first raider she targeted came apart before its evasion pattern had time to develop. She was already on the second before the debris had finished expanding. On the Enterprise bridge, Data watched the Viper engagement through the long-range sensor array with a level of sustained attention that on a human officer would have been identifiable as awe. The colonial fighters were 8 meters of kinetic delivery, each of them moving in 3-dimensional rolling evasion patterns he was cataloging in real time and had not previously encountered in any Starfleet tactical database. The pilots flew in a style developed against an enemy that could learn, which meant their patterns changed signature with every pass, never committing to a heading long enough to be predicted. He watched a Colonial Viper peel off a raider that had broken through the engagement perimeter fire once and reverse course to rejoin its wing before the raider finished burning, Captain, Data said. The Colonial fighters are engaging at close range using rolling evasion patterns I have not previously catalogued. Their kill rate against the Cylon fighters is significantly higher than our own craft. A pause. The difference is not marginal. Then a Cylon raider absorbed a phaser burst from a Starfleet runabout and kept flying. Worf watched it on his tactical screen. The raider had been hit clean, direct energy transfer, a hit that should have ended its engagement. It continued on its heading. Captain, the Cylon fighter adapted to the phaser frequency. It adapted in fewer than 3 exchanges, and it is ignoring the phaser fire. Now, like the Borg, Picard said. Like the Borg, Worf opened a direct channel to the Colonial Raptor crew, whose position put them closest to the adapted raider. Colonial Raptor. Lieutenant Commander Worf, Enterprise Tactical. The Cylon fighter at bearing EVO Horvio has adapted to our energy weapons. Your kinetic weapons, your physical projectile weapons. Query. Does the adaptation affect them? The Raptor held course. The crew took 1 second to process the request, then the Raptor's railgun fired a burst at the already adapted raider. The rounds hit. The raider did not adapt to kinetic impact. The raider came apart. The Raptor pilot's response was laconic, with the brevity of a person who had not been surprised. Doesn't seem to. Worf closed the channel and turned to Picard with an expression that was for him the functional equivalent of quiet satisfaction. The Colonial kinetic weapons do not trigger the same adaptive response. Data from the operations console. The Cylon adaptive mechanism targets energy frequency inputs. A kinetic round has no frequency to target. It is mass at velocity. The adaptation has nothing to read and nothing to counter. In the CIC aboard Galactica, Adama was running the engagement on 2 axes simultaneously. The kinetic cannons on Galactica's main batteries were firing on a Cylon base star that had advanced to close range, the base star's organic hull yielding where armor would crack, absorbing where plating would shear, but taking damage that accumulated. On the secondary display, the fighter, engagement, Vipers, and Starfleet runabouts and raiders in a melee that the D-Radis rendered as organized chaos, which was accurate. Ty watched the tactical display. "We're fighting their war for them, Admiral." Adama did not look up from the plotting table. "Their war, our war, same war now." The Enterprise was engaging a base star on the main tactical track, and Picard was watching with the focus of a captain who had been in enough fleet actions to identify a developing problem before his crew called it. The Enterprise's shields were holding against Cylon missile fire that would have opened Galactica's unshielded hull. The phaser arrays were doing genuine structural damage to the Bastar, its organic hull taking energy impacts in a way that conventional armor would not, burning rather than cracking, which was, in some respects, worse. But the base star had launched its full raider complement, and the raiders were adapting to phaser fire on the second exchange, and the photon torpedoes were subject to the same process. Energy weapons, energy adaptation. "Riker," Picard said, "Galactica. Tell them we need suppression fire on our radar screen, their kinetic weapons kinetic only." The joint action that followed was the first time both militaries had operated as a single tactical unit with a single purpose. Colonial Vipers peeled raiders off the Enterprise's attack run with the precision of pilots who had been hunting this enemy for 11 months. The Enterprise absorbed B-Star missile fire on its shields that would have ended Galactica. Neither force was complete without the other. The raiders that slipped past Viper Screen hit shield bubble instead of hull. The B-Stars that stood against Galactica's kinetic cannons absorbed damage from a weapons system they had no adaptive counter for. Mismatched gears turning together and turning. Cavill did not announce the decision. The B-Stars jumped without warning, the FTL displacement leaving nothing behind except residue and the debris field of several hundred destroyed raiders hanging in the vacuum, the aftermath of several hundred conversations between targeting computers and physics. Starbuck pulled her Viper around in a hard arc and watched the last B-Star's jump signature collapse on her D-Radis. She had 11 months of practice reading the difference between a Cylon fleet that was done and a Cylon fleet that was finished collecting information. "That's not a retreat," she said on the channel, flat, specific. The voice she used when she needed something remembered. "That's a reconnaissance." Nobody argued with her. She had earned the right to that read. In a corridor outside the Enterprise's secondary shuttle bay, a Colonial Viper pilot and a Starfleet ensign were standing 4 meters apart in the specific silence that follows a battle. Both parties survived, and neither has finished processing. The pilot's hand was not quite steady. She was holding it at her side and not looking at it, because looking at it was not the technique. The technique was awareness without acknowledgement, and you had to look carefully to notice, and most people did not look carefully. The ensign had been on a runabout during the engagement. It was his first time in live combat. His face had the quality of a person who has just discovered that knowing a thing is not the same as having it happen to you. They did not have words for each other. 11 months and an entire universe stood between their experiences of the last 45 minutes. But they were standing in the same corridor in the aftermath of a battle they had both come out of, and that was a starting point that neither of them had been certain of an hour ago. No warning. That was the thing about the Borg. They did not approach, they did not emerge from warp, in the conventional sense, with the visible distortion and plasma bloom of a vessel decelerating through relativistic speeds. They arrived through a transwarp conduit, a corridor of folded space that the collective had developed. Because standard warp was a limitation they saw no reason to accept, and what came out of that corridor was not a ship in any sense that prepared you for the scale. A Borg cube, roughly 3 kilometers on a side. Every surface covered in the accretion of stolen technology, assimilated components from thousands of species layered over each other in patterns that had no aesthetic logic and perfect functional logic. The accumulated architecture of everything the collective had decided was worth keeping from every civilization it had consumed. It detonated into normal space the way a star detonates into a system. Suddenly, completely, leaving no version of the sensor picture that had existed before. On the Enterprise bridge, data spoke before the alert systems finished cycling. "1 Borg cube, Captain. Bearing 115. Mark 7. A pause, measured in milliseconds, that read, on data, as hesitation. "I would suggest red alert. Picard was already standing. He had not moved from the position he had been in when the transwarp conduit opened. He was looking at the view screen, and for a specific and limited duration, he was not entirely on the bridge of the Enterprise. He was somewhere that had no coordinates in navigational terms and a very clear sensory memory. And beneath the sensory memory were 11,000 voices that had not made it off their ships at Will 359, and underneath those voices was the cadence of a man named Jean-Luc Picard speaking words he had not chosen to say. And for the span of 1 full second, he was there. Then he came back. "Red alert," Picard said. "All hands." The cube did not move toward the colonial fleet. It moved toward the Cylon base stars. The base stars had re-emerged from their jump approximately 12 minutes after their withdrawal, as the collective had calculated they would, a fleet regrouping at a predictable interval. The cube's approach vector intersected the lead base star's position at a closing rate that left no ambiguity about intent. The collective issued no transmission. It simply began the process. A Borg drone was aboard the lead Cylon base star 17 seconds after the cube reached optimal range. Then 20 drones, then a number that no one on either side had time to count before the breach expanded. In the base star's command center, Number 1 watched the breach alerts propagate across the display in real time. He had authored the fall of the 12 colonies from within the certainty of a species that had solved the problem of death with engineering rather than philosophy, that had built a resurrection hub that had made itself permanent. He had never needed to fear anything with the full weight of something that could not be reversed. He watched a Borg drone close its hand around a Cylon Centurion's arm and begin the conversion. Nanoprobes moving through the Centurion's mechanical systems and finding them improbably compatible. He watched the Centurion stop responding to command protocols. Cavill had spent 11 months engineering the destruction of 50,000 people with complete confidence in his own continuity. The confidence was gone. In Galactica's CIC, the DADIS showed it all in real time, and everyone who could see the display was watching in a silence that had no precedent in 11 months of running. Their most feared enemy, the machine civilization that had killed 50 billion people, that had hunted the last 50,000 across the edge of the universe, being taken apart by something worse. The Cylon base stars were firing on the cube with everything they had, and the cube's surface was absorbing the fire and cycling through it without any response that indicated distress. The assimilation drones continued to pour through the breach in an orderly stream. Orderly was the word that made it worse. It should have felt like justice. Some part of the CIC would have admitted the word had occurred to them. It did not feel like justice. Starbuck said it without preamble from the tactical station. Lords of Kobol. The silence held. Tai spoke without looking away from the DRAS. We need to move the fleet. Adama looked at the display. Move it where? Nobody had an answer. The cube turned. It had extracted what it came for from the partially assimilated bar star, an incomplete acquisition, a thread of data the collective was already processing. The biological digital architecture of Cylon resurrection, the mechanism by which a consciousness could be transferred out of a destroyed body and restored in a new one. The collective had not yet assembled the full picture of what that process meant, but it had enough to follow the signal, and the signal it was following now was the faint residual frequency that Cylon consciousness transfer left in the cellular structure of any recently resurrected Cylon. It had found that frequency aboard the colonial fleet. The cube turned toward the fleet. A voice came through on all colonial frequencies, and on all Enterprise frequencies, and on every channel available to every ship in both formations, in the harmonic of a chorus that had swallowed thousands of civilizations and kept something of every one of them. We are the Borg. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Resistance is futile. Picard opened a direct channel to Galactica. Admiral, we need to run, not fight. We don't run from. You can die here with everything you love, Picard said, or you can jump your fleet out and plan. One of those options lets you protect your people. The Borg have partially assimilated Cylon resurrection data. They have detected humanoid Cylons aboard your ships. Your people are what they want most. If you stay and fight, you give them a stationary target. A pause. Admiral, Adama looked at the DRADIS, at the cube's bearing and closing rate, at the survivor count on the plaque. "Jump coordinates," he said. "Give me coordinates." Picard gave them. The colonial fleet began jumping, one ship at a time. Each departure was a flash of displaced silver light that bloomed and collapsed in the space of a second, the specific visual signature of an FTL system that moved ships through a mechanism the Federation had no precedent for. The civilian ships went first, then the escort vessels, then the military ships around Galactica, one after another, the fleet contracting toward the Battlestar at its center. As the vessels around it vanished, the Enterprise fired. Phaser arrays at full power, every bank that could be brought to bear on the cube's primary hull, the beams striking the surface in overlapping patterns that the cube began adapting to within the first exchange. The adaptive plating cycled through frequency ranges methodically, narrowing the effective window. 4 exchanges and the phasers were adapted out. Picard switched to photon torpedoes. But 4 exchanges was seconds, and seconds were what Galactica needed. The last civilian ship jumped. The last escort jumped. Galactica's FTL drives completed their spool-up cycle. Jump calculation locked, and the warship held its position while the Enterprise spent the last of its adapted-out window buying time with weapons fire that was no longer hurting anything. Then the flash, the last silver bloom of displaced light. Galactica was gone. The Enterprise went to warp. The cube drifted in the space where 2 fleets had been. Deep in the collective's shared consciousness, something was being processed that had not been in the hive mind before this engagement. An incomplete thread. A partial read of a mechanism the collective had never encountered in any of the thousands of civilizations it had assimilated. The concept was simple enough to state in a single sentence. The implications would take longer to fully integrate a consciousness that does not end when its body is destroyed. The Borg had catalogued species that believed such things were possible, had classified those beliefs as mythology, as philosophy, as the kind of story a species told itself about death, because the alternative was too difficult to accept. They had never encountered a civilization that had engineered it. The acquisition was incomplete. The Borg were very interested in completing it. The conference room on the Enterprise D felt too clean for the conversation it was about to hold. Picard had arranged the seating in the form Starfleet used for joint command consultations. Federation side along one length of the table, colonial side along the other, no implied hierarchy in the placement. The table was glass and metal, and the ambient lighting of a ship designed by people who believed the physical environment should communicate optimism. It was not the right room for what was about to be said, but it was the room they had. Sisko was present on the wall screen from Deep Space Nine, watching with the stillness of a man who has been in enough crisis rooms to know that the most important things said in them are usually said at an angle. Data led the threat briefing. He presented the Borg cube's acquisition from the Ceylon Baystar. Incomplete resurrection data, a partial read enough for the collective to identify the signal source as the humanoid Ceylons aboard the colonial fleet. He did not editorialize. He presented the analysis and its implications, and then he stopped, because the implications did not require elaboration. Roslin said, "So our people are a beacon." Picard said, "They are what the Borg want most." "Then I have a question." She looked at Picard across the table with the directness she had been using to make rooms uncomfortable, since before she had authority to back it with. "Tell me what you would do. In our place, 50,000 people, Every other human being in our universe dead. The machines we built hunted us to the edge of extinction. What principle do you reach for when survival is the only thing left?" The room was quiet. Picard said, "The same one your president carries with her. The same one that brought your fleet here, rather than scattering it. You did not run to die fighting. You ran toward something. A home, a future worth having. That is not survival for its own sake. That is hope. Hope has a shape. It has requirements. You cannot build a home on the principles you abandoned to get there." Rosalind looked at him. She did not agree. She did not disagree. Adama said, "With respect, Captain, you have never watched your civilization burn. The Federation has never faced what we have faced. Your enlightened restraint has never been tested at the cost of 50 billion lives." Picard said quietly, "I was assimilated by the Borg. The room held. My mind was used to direct the destruction of 39 Starfleet vessels. My voice ordered 11,000 people to their deaths. I know what it is to be used by the thing you fear most. I know it from the inside." He did not raise his voice. He had been speaking quietly throughout. "And I know what comes after, because I chose to come after it. Not to network no machine, not to abandon every principle that made survival worth having, but to find the line between what must be and what must never be." A pause. "That line is where the Federation lives." Adama was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice held something that was not argument. "You got to come back from it." Picard met his eyes. "So did you. That is why you are here." No one spoke. Cisco on the wall screen had gone very still. Picard looked down the table at Athena. She had been seated at the colonial end at his specific request, and had been sitting with the stillness of a person who knows why they are in a room and is waiting for the reason to be named. "The Federation resolved a legal question," Picard said, "that I would like your people to consider, whether an artificial being has rights of self-determination, whether a being that serves, that sacrifices, that forms relationships, and defends the people it has chosen constitutes a person by any meaningful standard." He looked at her directly. "You have served this fleet. You have defended people who fear what you are, consistently, under conditions that would have broken most humans I know. By any standard that matters, you are a person. The Federation recognizes that. Whatever your people decide about Cylons as a category, that recognition stands for you individually." Athena said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was entirely level, which was the way she handled things that were not. "Tell that to the people who tried to take me apart." Picard held her gaze. He did not apologize for them, because an apology was inadequate, and she knew it, and she deserved better than something inadequate. Troya had been silent throughout the meeting. She spoke now, and the quality of the room changed, because Troy's voice in a meeting of this kind carried a weight that the other participants had learned to read. "There is something I need to say." She waited until she had Adama's attention. "Before I do, Admiral, I want you to understand that I am telling you this because I believe you need to know it, and because the alternative is worse." She had been carrying this since the Pyxis. Through the battle and the retreat and the regrouping, she had been carrying it. In my empathic reads of the colonial fleet, confirmed by medical tricorder data that has since been cross-referenced, there are 4 individuals aboard your ships who register biological digital patterns consistent with the humanoid Cylons in your fleet. She met Adama's eyes. "One of them is in this room." Tai was standing at the wall behind the colonial seats, in the position of the XO who is present but not at the table. He had stood in that position for 30 years. He stood very still. He had suspected. He had spent weeks, not permitting himself to name the suspicion, not allowing it to sit still long enough to be examined, not finding the version of his own history that was consistent with what he was beginning to understand. Someone else had named it for him now, in a room full of people whose reactions he was not ready to see. He looked at Adama. "Bill," he said, "one word. Adama's name. Just that." Riker's hand moved toward his sidearm. It was reflex, not decision, and he caught the motion before it completed. Worf moved a half-step forward and stopped himself, holding there with the effort of it. Roslin, across the table, closed her eyes. Adama went the color of someone who has just had a structural assumption removed from under him and has not yet found what to stand on. Sisko said nothing. Data observed with the particular quality of attention he used when the moment was more important than his assessment of it. Picard looked at Adama and did not speak. This was not his moment to speak. Adama was a long time silent. Long enough that the silence became a statement of its own. When he spoke, it was in the voice he used when there was nothing left to argue about, and the argument had been the thing holding him up. Saltai has served the colonial fleet for 30 years. He has bled for it. He has held this ship together on the days I could not. He looked at Tai. If he is a Cylon. A pause that cost him something that was going to cost him more in the days ahead. He is also my oldest friend, and I am not going to solve that problem today. He turned to Picard. We have a Borg cube to deal with. We deal with that. Then we deal with this, Picard said, agreed. Tai was standing at a viewport in a corridor near the conference room when Data found him. Data stood beside him without speaking first. Outside the viewport, the colonial fleet held its position in the coordinates Picard had given Adama. A Federation vessel in escort formation, the configuration of ships that was both an offer of protection and a polite fact about who had the firing solutions on whom. Colonel Tai, Data said. I was told, for most of my existence, that I was a machine, and therefore did not qualify for the rights extended to persons. I spent considerable time determining whether that assessment was accurate, a pause, selected with care. I concluded that it was not. Tai looked at the wrong stars. He did not look at Data. Good for you. I believe the question is ongoing, Data said, for both of us. Tai said nothing else. The fleet held its formation outside, and the stars that were visible through the viewport were someone else's stars in someone else's universe. And Colonel Saltai stood in a Federation corridor and found out, finally, what he had always been. They planned it around the tactical display in Galactica's CIC, and the first thing that became clear was that they were not planning the same battle. Picard approached it the way Starfleet doctrine had taught him. The Borg's adaptive mechanism targeted energy frequency inputs, so the weapons that would work were the weapons with no energy frequency signature to read. The colonial kinetic cannons, the railguns, the physical projectile systems, the Alpha Quadrant had set aside for directed energy centuries ago that the colonials had never set aside because their enemy adapted to everything else. Adama approached it from the other end. The question for him was not what weapons to use. The question was how to get inside the range at which the cube's response time gave it an advantage. At Wolf 359, he said, the cube had time to adapt between weapons exchanges. It had time to reposition. If we take that time away from it, the jump, Picard said. Adama looked at him. At New Caprica, Galactica executed an in-atmosphere jump. We dropped directly onto a target at effectively zero distance, delivered our forces, and jumped out before the enemy could respond. He looked at the tactical display. 3,000 meters from the cube's primary hull, Galactica and its full Viper complement deploying on the other side. We would be inside any response window the cube has available, Riker said. That is either brilliant or suicide, Adama said. In my experience, those aren't mutually exclusive. Picard looked at the display for a moment. There is a second component. I know the Borg hive link from the inside. I know which subspace frequencies carry the coordinating signal. I know which nodes route the command architecture to the Queen. If we produce a precisely calibrated subspace pulse, Data can build the calculation. We disrupt the hive link, the drone's coordination dissolves. He looked at Adama for approximately 4 seconds before the collective adapts to it. 4 seconds, Adama said. Yes, Adama looked at the plaque on the CIC bulkhead at the number, then back at the display. 4 seconds is enough. The transwarp conduit opened without warning, and the cube emerged the way. It always emerged, completely, suddenly, at a scale. The sensor picture needed a moment to accommodate. It had changed. New structures along its surface, darker than the surrounding plating, Cylon resurrection architecture integrated into the collective's framework in real time, the process unfinished. The Borg had returned to complete it, and the source material they needed was aboard the colonial fleet. The cube broadcast on all frequencies. We are the Borg. You will be assimilated. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Data spoke from the operations console. Captain, the Borg Collective's communication carries a new harmonic. It is broadcasting on frequencies consistent with Cylon resurrection signal architecture. It is attempting to communicate with the humanoid Cylons aboard the colonial fleet. Calling to them, Riker said. Attempting to, Data said. In Galactica's CIC, T's hands were on the edge of the plotting table. Not for balance, for an anchor, a fixed point in a room that was becoming difficult to stay present in. The broadcast was doing something at a level below thought, something that was not sound in any frequency his ears could register, but that his constructed biology was receiving as a signal that wanted a response. He held the table and did not respond. Adama looked at him. So, I'm fine, Ty said. He tightened his grip. He was choosing in real time which thing he was, and the thing he was choosing was the thing he had been for 30 years before he had known there was a choice to make. He was choosing the CIC, the Admiral, the count on the plaque, the weight of everything he had done in this ship's service that could not be unmade by what he was. I'm fine, Admiral. Tell me where to aim. Adama held his gaze for 1 second. Then he turned to the navigation board. Viper Wing. All squadrons. You launch on my mark. On the other side, Raptor support. On my mark. On the other side. He looked at the jump calculation. The countdown had already started, because that was how Galactica worked. The countdown started when the decision was made, not when the order was given. Mark the FTL drive fired. The flash of silver light that was Galactica vanishing from normal space was visible across the combined fleet. On the other side of that flash, 3,000 meters from the Borg cube's primary hull, the Battlestar detonated back into normal space with her full kinetic weapons complement already cycling to fire, a 1,400-meter warship arriving at effective engagement range before the cube's response protocols had registered what it was looking at. Colonial railguns at point-blank range, against a Borg cube. The shields came up and began adapting to energy outputs, to fire control electronic signatures, to every frequency the arriving vessel was producing. What they could not adapt to, physical mass at high velocity. Galactica's kinetic cannons tore into the cube's surface, plating in the gaps between shield modulations and the structural integrity. Fields the Borg raised to compensate, were better than nothing. The Vipers launched on the other side of the jump, exactly as ordered, emerging immediately adjacent to the cube's secondary hull. They flew into the gaps, killed the drones attempting to respond to the breach, and kept the cube's external defenses pointed away from Galactica's primary batteries. On the Enterprise, Data had the calculation ready. The pulse will disrupt coordinating signal throughput across the cube's primary hive-link nodes, he said. Duration before collective adaptation. My estimate is between 3 and 5 seconds. I cannot narrow the range further without live sensor data from inside the link architecture. Picard was at the command position. He had spent 3 years carrying the architecture of Borg neural pathways in the parts of his memory he did not choose to visit, and he was visiting them now because they were useful now, because the nightmares had an engineering application, and Data had built the calculation around it. "Ready on your mark, Captain," Data said. "Fire," Picard said. The subspace pulse hit the cube's hive-link nodes in the sequence Data had calculated and disrupted them in the order Picard had known it would. The cube shuddered. The drones on its hull exterior staggered and lost coherent motion for a duration the sensors measured at 4.3 seconds. 4.3 seconds in which the Colonial Fleet's nuclear warhead delivery systems completed their firing solution. Not photon torpedoes, not quantum torpedoes. A physical chemical nuclear detonation, the category of weapon that the Borg's adaptive matrix had never been calibrated against, because nothing in the Alpha Quadrant had deployed one against the collective in the lifetime of any officer who had faced them. The adaptation system had no entry for it. It had nothing to adapt to. The warhead detonated inside the cube's central structure. The cube broke apart. Not controlled, not cascading, not any recognizable military destruction pattern. It came apart the way a thing comes apart, when the structure holding it together stops being there. The accumulated technology of thousands of assimilated civilizations joining the debris field at the expansion velocity of the detonation. Galactica sat in the debris field with hull plating cracked in 3 sections, secondary power systems down across 2 decks, 1 Viper unaccounted for, and then the pilot recovered, clinging to a piece of her own wreckage. The Enterprise had taken comparable damage across its primary shield array and a secondary plasma conduit that would need replacement before the next engagement. The survivor counter on the CIC plaque showed the same number it had shown before. The battle, nobody died who was not already dead. Adama stood at the plotting table with his eyes closed. One moment, 30 years of making the call, and carrying the count and one more count that had held. He opened his eyes. Ty was at the plotting table across from him. They looked at each other across the display, across the conference room, and everything that had been named in it, and everything that had not been resolved, across 30 years of service and the argument about what they were and the weight of what they had done together. The argument was a shorter distance than the certainty. The certainty was what they had built, and it had held, and it was still holding. "Good work, Colonel," Adama said. Ty said, "Aye, sir." The Federation Council's chamber on Earth was a room built for exactly this kind of impossible moment, and Lee Adama stood in its subspace representation, projected on the Enterprise's conference screen and framed by the Council's semicircular gallery, and made his case, in the voice of a man who had spent a year learning that arguments have weight only when the person making them is prepared to pay the cost. He said, "We are the last 50,000 of our kind. We did not choose this universe. We did not choose what we brought with us. We are asking for the thing your Federation was built to give, a place to exist without being hunted." The Council asked its questions. They had the medical data. They knew about the humanoid Cylons in the fleet, They knew about the Borg engagement and what it had cost and what had ended it. They knew about the Section 31 operative whose actions had nearly started a war, before the war that had actually started. They asked about the Cylons with the careful tone of people whose fear was real and whose uncertainty about what to do with that fear was also real. And Lee answered each question with the specific steadiness of someone who had watched his father accept a Cylon into their service, who had been present when the argument about what that meant had been argued all the way to the floor. The council voted. Provisional asylum. The colonial fleet would take up residence in a designated Federation sector. Starfleet would provide medical and material support. In return, the fleet agreed to ongoing medical monitoring, which meant Federation scanners would have access to the fleet's population, which meant the question of who aboard was and was not human was now a permanent open item rather than a secret. The colonials hated the terms. Roslin accepted them anyway. Survival above comfort was the one principle she had not broken in a year of choices that had broken most of the others. She accepted the terms in the morning. In the afternoon, a Federation doctor came to her with a medical file. The cancer she carried, relapsing, resistant to the treatments the fleet's own physicians had applied, was, by Federation medical standards, not manageable. Curable. The word arrived without softening, offered by a doctor who was kind and professional and had no way of knowing what it cost. The scans were unambiguous, the protocols were established, the treatment timeline was 14 weeks. Roslin sat with that for a moment. The scrolls of Pythia said the dying leader would not live to reach the promised land. She had carried that sentence for a year. The way a person carries a sentence they have already decided is true. The way you carry a thing that has begun to feel like part of your structure rather than a weight on top of it. She had led her people here. Whether this place qualified as the promised land was a question that had several answers depending on which reading of the scrolls you were working from, and whether the Alpha Quadrant counted as a destination or merely a detour. Whether she was still dying was, apparently, now debatable. She told the doctor she needed time to think. He left. She sat with the file in her hands and looked at stars that were not the stars of the Cyranus system and did not yet know what she was going to decide. Sisko arrived on the Enterprise's observation deck 3 hours later and found her there. He had not come with answers, because he had learned that answers were not what this kind of moment called for. He was the emissary of the prophets to the Bajoran people, a religious title he had not applied for, a role that had arrived through a wormhole and affixed itself to his career file despite everything he had done to classify it as someone else's calling. He knew what it was to stand in the center of someone else's scripture and try to navigate it without losing the parts of yourself the prophecy had not accounted for. He had spent years fighting the idea that a destiny and a self could occupy the same person without one of them winning. He told her that without ceremony, she listened. He did not tell her what to choose. He told her what it had felt like to finally stop fighting the coexistence, not because the prophecy and the self had agreed, but because both were real and real things had to be engaged rather than resolved. She sat across from him with the medical file still in her hands and absorbed it. She did not look healed when he left, but she looked fractionally less alone, which was what he had crossed half the sector to provide. In the Enterprise's secondary briefing room, Data had laid out an analysis that he had produced in the interval between the Borg engagement and the Council's vote. Adama stood across the table from him and listened while the android explained, with the clean technical precision he used when the goal was clarity rather than connection, how colonial jump drive technology and Federation warp systems were complementary in a way that neither civilization had yet considered. Instantaneous point-to-point displacement used as an evasion layer over conventional warp capability. the jump drive not as primary propulsion, but as a pursuit denial mechanism. The result? Colonial ships that would become effectively impossible to track during a jump, and therefore immune to the long-range signature detection the Borg had exploited. The analysis was correct. Adama could see it was correct without being an engineer. He set it down. "You did this for us. I did it because it was an interesting problem," Data said. "And because you are here." Adama looked at him in the way he looked at things he was still working through. "The thing about you that my people are afraid of, it is not what you are. It is that they cannot tell the difference between you and the things that killed us." "Yes," Data said. "I am aware of the difficulty. How do you live with it?" The android considered the question with the care he applied to questions that were not primarily technical. "I find the most effective approach is to continue demonstrating the difference." A pause. "Over time." Adama looked at him for a moment. He picked up the analysis. "Send this to my chief engineer." The medical file on Kara Thrace came back flagged. The anomalies were not consistent with any Cylon biological digital pattern the Federation's database carried. They were also not consistent with colonial human physiology or any human physiology in any way the Federation's medical resources could account for. The database had no classification for what the scans were showing. This was not a gap in the technology. The equipment was working, it had found something real, and the entry for it simply did not exist. The duty physician escalated to the CMO. The CMO escalated to Picard. Picard brought the file to Adama in person, because that was the kind of thing you brought in person. The Admiral read it. He set it down. He was quiet for a moment. In the particular way he was quiet when the decision had already been made, and he was giving the room time to catch up. "Violet, Admiral. This does require further review. I know what it requires." He held Picard's gaze. "She's my pilot." Picard studied him. He did not push. He filed it. The plaque in Galactica's CIC showed the same number it had shown at the end of the battle, the same number it had shown for months, with the variations being downward and only downward. Adama had stopped looking at it directly, the way you stop looking directly at something that carries too much weight to be observed casually. A colonial medic came through the CIC late that evening on her way to somewhere else. She paused at the plaque. She took the marker from her coat pocket. A girl had been born in the civilian fleet. 6 pounds 4 ounces, in a sick bay aboard the Astral Queen, under conditions that were better than anything the fleet had managed in the previous year, under lighting that worked properly and with Federation medical support on call if needed. The mother had reportedly said that the delivery room smelled like recycled air, and she wanted to name the baby something that sounded nothing like a ship's registry number. The attending physician had told her that sounded about right. The medic changed one digit on the plaque, the number went up. Adama was passing through when she did it. He stopped. He stood there looking at the plaque for a moment with no particular expression, and then for a moment with an expression that was not the one he kept ready for use in rooms with other people in them. And then with no expression again. He walked on. But something in the way he carried himself was different by a small and specific amount. The weight of a year of watching one direction loosened for just this moment by the fact of a single digit moving the other way. There was no warning. There was never a warning with Q. He appeared in Galactica's CIC between one breath and the next, dressed in a colonial officer's uniform that he had selected with the care of someone who understood that costuming is a form of argument. He was standing at the plotting table, studying the plaque on the CIC bulkhead, and he looked at it the way a being who has existed for several geological epochs looks at things that have recently changed, with the specific interest of something that rarely encounters novelty. "Up one," he said. That's new. Tai had his hand on his sidearm before his brain had fully processed the apparition, which was the correct response and was also entirely useless, and some part of him knew both things simultaneously. Adama stepped forward from the plotting table. Picard had warned him about Q. The warning, it turned out, had been insufficient preparation for the actual experience of Q standing in the CIC in a colonial uniform and looking deeply entertained about something. "Who are you?" Adama said. He had used that tone against Cylons and admirals and his own son on the worst day of his life. It was the voice of a man who had stopped having patience for games several decades before the end of the worlds. Questia looked at him with the expression of someone who has just encountered a new species of interesting. "Someone who has been watching," he said. "With considerable interest. On the Enterprise D, the transporter locked on without being asked." Picard felt the familiar dissolution and arrived in Galactica's CIC to find Q at the plotting table in a colonial dress uniform. That was exactly the kind of theatrical choice Q had always made, and was no less disorienting for being predictable. "Q," Picard said, a greeting that contained an entire relationship. "Mon capitaine." Call turned to him with the warmth of a being who genuinely looked forward to these meetings, which was always the most alarming thing about them. "I brought you a gift." He gestured at the colonial fleet, visible through the viewport, the formation that had held against Cylons and the Borg, the 50,000 people who had navigated the distance between universes and were still here, a whole civilization. "Don't say I never give you anything. You did not bring them here," Picard said. Q's smile had several layers. The outermost layer was theatrical. What lived beneath it was harder to read. "Didn't I?" He turned back to Adama. The performance dropped by a fraction, just enough to indicate that what came next was not entirely theater. What remained underneath was something that might have been, in a sufficiently alien register, genuine interest. "You carried 50,000 souls across the dark between universes, Admiral," Q said. "Through a Cylon fleet, through the Borg, through Starfleet bureaucracy, which I personally find more terrifying than either." He looked at T, who was still holding very still. "Your monsters are still aboard. Your secrets are still unresolved." His gaze moved briefly toward the viewport, toward the fleet beyond it. "Your pilot, who died and came back. Still a mystery, that one." He turned back to Adama. "All this has happened before." He waited. Adama looked at him. "Yes," he said. Q blinked. He had expected argument, denial, the kind of reflexive resistance that made these conversations worth having. "Yes," he said, as if the word had an unexpected taste. "All of it has happened before." Adama was not making a speech. He was stating a sequence of facts in the order they had occurred. "We built machines. The machines killed us. We ran. We fought. We found enemies we didn't understand, and enemies that were worse than the ones we knew. We made every mistake we swore we wouldn't make." He looked at Tai. He looked at Athena, who had arrived in the CIC silently, as someone who had earned the right to be present tended to arrive. He looked at the plaque with its changed digit. And then we did one thing we hadn't done before. Q was very still. For a being of his nature, stillness was the highest form of attention. "What? We stopped running," Adama said. The silence in the CIC was the kind that follows something that has landed in a different part of the ship. Roslyn sat alone with the Federation doctor's medical file in her hands. The scrolls of Pythia had been written for a dying leader carrying a dying people toward a promised land. The scripture had not specified what universe the promised land would be in. She was no longer quite the dying leader. The question of who she was, instead, had not yet been answered. She was holding the file. And she had gone still in the way a person goes still when they have made the decision and are waiting to catch up to it. In the CIC, Q studied Adama for a long moment, then Picard. Then the plaque with its blue marker digit. "We stopped running," he said slowly, as if translating it into a dozen languages at once and checking for meaning in each of them. "That is either the most enlightened thing I have heard from a mortal in 300 years, he paused, "or it is the most dangerous. I always find those two things so difficult to tell apart." He snapped his fingers. In the CIC, nothing visibly changed. On the sensor grid, no anomaly registered. In the subspace architecture of the Alpha Quadrant, something shifted in a way that would have required the Borg's full computational resources to detect, and would have appeared, even then, as natural resonance variation. "I have put you in a blind spot," Q said. "For now the Borg will not find you today." A pause. "Whether you deserve that is a question I find genuinely interesting." He looked at Adama one more time with the expression of something that has been surprised, which is rarer for Q than for anything else that exists. "I will be watching." He was gone. Adama stood at the plotting table. T stood across from him. Picard stood near the hatch. The CIC held its configuration, its crew, its count on the plaque. The fleet beyond the viewport held its formation. The thing that Q had done in the subspace architecture of the quadrant was done, and was not undoable. They were still here. In the outer system, in the debris field, where the Borg cube had been, the wreckage of the partially assimilated Cylon Battlestar turned slowly in the dark. The breach in its hull was sealed only partially, organic tissue having grown most of the way across the opening before the battle ended and the impulse to heal had run out of context. The hybrid that served as the Battlestar's navigational consciousness had not been fully assimilated. It was still alive, still generating its fragmented stream of consciousness, still broadcasting on frequencies that only Cylons could fully pass. What it was transmitting in the rhythm that was not quite language and the pattern that was not quite signal was something that would have required a Cylon to interpret. The Colonials did not yet know it was still running, and in the vast distributed mind of the Borg collective, the partial data extracted from that Battlestar before the disruption was still being processed, still being integrated against the collective's accumulated knowledge of biological digital architecture. The Borg had not returned because they were still working. They were patient. They had always been patient. They would finish working eventually. Adama stood at the plotting table with his coffee. The stars outside the viewport were not his stars, not the sky visible from the colonies, not any light his family had navigated by. They were someone else's stars, in someone else's universe, in a quadrant, still deciding what to make of 50,000 survivors who had arrived uninvited and had proven twice that they were not the easiest thing to kill. He had navigated harder situations. He looked at the plaque, at the number that had gone up by one in blue marker and had not changed since. He drank his coffee. Outside the viewport, a Viper climbed out of the flight pod and ran a practice pass on a heading that had not existed in any colonial navigation chart until 3 weeks ago. New vectors in new space, with nothing charted at the end of the heading that any of them had been looking for when this started, but a heading nonetheless. The fleet was still here. So say we all, if that fleet had made it through what they made it through and landed in your universe, which ally would you have wanted them to find first? Picard, Cisco, or someone else entirely? Drop it in the comments below. And if you want to know what the Borg do with that resurrection data, or what the hybrid is still transmitting in the dark. Tell us,